for this panel discussion, obviously this whole conference is especially timely, but this panel is doubly especially timely, talking about election integrity, and we're going to touch on that from a few different angles, but obviously the biggest news around election integrity is foreign meddling in elections, and I want to, I'll introduce all our panelists, but I think in light of recent news and events, it's important to get any reactions that relate to, some of what's developed in the federal inquiry into the 2016 election. We obviously want to talk a lot about New York and legislation here, needed reforms, resources, et cetera, risks, but we certainly want to touch on that as well. But first, our panelists. So hopefully coming in on the far end of the table will be Senator Todd Kaminsky. Next to me is Assemblymember David Buchwald. Next to him is State Senator Liz Krueger. Next to her is Board of Elections Executive Director Michael Ryan. That's the New York City Board of Elections. And next to him is Eva Guidarini, the U.S. Politics and Government Outreach at Facebook, and Eric Hodge, Director of Consulting at CyberScout. Thank you all for being here. So I'll just open it up for reactions to what we've learned in the last few days, and if anything you saw yesterday from President Trump, but especially anything in the last few days, what we've learned about what happened in the 2016 elections. Any reactions for generally what it means about the integrity of elections broadly, but especially in New York? Assemblymember?
I'll begin only since I'm first to your left. First of all, I want to commend City and State for having arranged the Russo-American Summit yesterday to perfectly time this summit here. And one of the things I've gained an appreciation of, and I'm chairman of the Assembly's Election Law Subcommittee on Election Day Operations and Voter Disenfranchisement, is that thankfully, we've had a fairly proactive approach here in New York. Not to toot my subcommittee's own horn and the entire Assembly Election Committee, but we've actually had already 2 public hearings on election security, the most recent of which was this past November after the local elections. And if you were at that hearing, if you watched online, you would have heard the words Cambridge Analytica 4 months before they became national news. And that's the sort of thing that, part of our function certainly as legislators is to try to share information and make sure the public's aware of what's percolating in terms of awareness of what went on, specifically in 2016, but also the ongoing threats that we face. And then the, other takeaway that I have is, in terms of the 2016 elections is, we certainly cannot let our guard down. There's no doubt in my mind that not only was there an effort, but every intelligence indication is that it's an ongoing effort to influence elections. Thankfully, in 2016, New York was not one of the 21 states specifically targeted by Russia, but nonetheless, we cannot just simply rely on the fact that we have a decentralized system and, there's some inherent redundancies in the election law administration, but nonetheless, we have to take an approach that's very much forward-looking. The State Board of Elections has done that. They've hosted a series of tabletop scenarios around the state in order to put to the test the statements about election security here in New York. We as a legislature, with government support, have put forward $5 million for cybersecurity. These are sorts of things that need to be occurring, as opposed to what we heard from the president, which was sort of a denial about the past, let alone a recognition of what threats we face going forward.
Rather than talk about the fact that apparently they are hacking our elections and we have to assume we'll have future elections hacked, I think the lesson from yesterday, I agree the timing is perfect for this discussion, was if you don't have actually any faith that your elected officials are going to follow the law and uphold their duties and responsibilities, you're in serious trouble as a state, a city, or a country. And also, if you don't have a press corps that will hold strong to digging for the truth, to standing on the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes those of us in elected office, apparently we think we can do anything. So my theme would be the importance of holding our feet to the fire and having a system in place in this country where integrity is expected and can be penalized for the lack of it whenever and wherever necessary, and that seriously, even though electeds have a terrible reputation, I fear the press have a worse one now, and that's with intent by certain people. We need to reestablish the importance of an independent, quality, investigative journalism system in this country for the sake of democracy. And then we need to make sure that we are holding accountable the people we elect into our democracy.
Go ahead. Senator Kaminsky just walked in.
Welcome, Senator Kaminsky.
Hey, Todd.
How are you?
Senator, you want
I missed the question.
Well, why don't we keep going down in this direction? I mean, the question generally is just the introductory, any reactions to recent news from the Mueller investigation and how President Trump has responded and what it means generally for the topic of this panel, which is election integrity, but especially, of course, any New York angles that you see.
Right, so I think under these circumstances, it's very easy to focus on the negatives of what's going on. Where we sit at the Board of Elections, I would rather focus on the positive steps that have been taken since the summer of 2016. Clearly, the issues that arose during the lead up to the presidential election in 2016 were a little bit surprising given the timing, but not necessarily surprising given the overall state of cybersecurity. If it didn't happen then, it was likely to happen at some point. If it wasn't the particular actors that are being alleged, it would be some other actors. There's always folks out there that want to make mischief. The good thing is, and you could thank the folks on this panel for setting up a proper election structure, the state elected officials. New York State does not have a networked elections system. Each scanner machine that you approach at a poll site is an independent machine. The election results are stored on the device on two separate, they look like flash drives. We call them portable memory devices, PMDs. One is for the unofficial results. The other remains with the machine itself for the official results. And in addition to that, there is paper backup. So if there was ever a really catastrophic event, we still have the paper to make sure that even though the mischief occurred, the outcome and the integrity of the outcome, which is all we can ultimately preserve, is maintained. The other good thing is, because of the threats that occurred in 2016, we started in New York City coordinating at first with the Department of Information, Telecommunications, and Technology, and we did our first tabletop exercises in the lead up to Election Day. Now, when you say the word tabletop exercise, it sounds like a bureaucratic meeting of people. It's like tabletop exercise. What is that? Tabletop exercises are the way that agencies keep the muscles limber, reenacting real-world scenarios in a serious way. And we did a tabletop exercise on the Thursday before a presidential election for about almost 7 hours. Shows you the seriousness with which everyone took that. The Department of Homeland Security for the state and the federal government was present. There was probably 50 people around the table, FBI, NYPD, all levels of law enforcement, all state and local officials and federal officials properly represented. In that moment, we were less concerned about the actual tampering of the results and more concerned with what has now turned out to be really where this last go-round took us, which is the manipulation of social media to move the needle one way or the other. We were concerned in the lead up to Election Day that people would put out false information that poll sites were on fire, or that no voting was happening at particular locations. Real misinformation causing chaos as opposed to manipulation of the results.
So we'll come back to you for
Sure.
more, but I think that comment is perfect to move down the line to our social media representative. Eva?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us here. And I think that you're right, that making sure that we stop the propagation of misinformation is critical to keeping elections secure. So I think Facebook's taking a couple of big steps in this space. The first is that we've seen a lot of misinformation, or most misinformation on the platform comes from fake accounts, right? The Russian government creates fake accounts. People create fake accounts to sort of spread this information. So making sure we shut down fake accounts is sort of step one on this front. But the other step is making sure that we have third-party fact checkers, right? People who can find information that is false and quickly respond to it. We can then downrank that information, and when people see it or click on it, show them an article from a fact checker telling them that it's false. If they shared it, send them a notification and say, hey, you shared information that was then later marked false. Do you want to remove that or tell your friends? So I think there's a lot of steps we need to take in this space, especially around elections, to make sure that we keep that misinformation off the platform. But I also think the other piece of this is making sure that we're being really transparent and sharing information that we have with our governments. Facebook has a threat intelligence team that spends a lot of time and money looking into threats on the platform. But we recognize that what's happening on Facebook is just one small slice of the pie of what's happening sort of in the greater world of elections integrity. So it's really important that we give all the information we have in our slice of the pie to Homeland Security, to the FBI, to these government agencies that can see the whole picture. They need to have our piece of the pie to see the whole picture, but we recognize that we don't see everything. So it's really important that we share that information with the governments.
Just quickly before we move down the line, the third-party fact-checking that you mentioned, can you just explain that a little bit more? I think that was quick, and I think that'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, so after the 2016 election, we realized that we needed to take some very serious steps to start to address misinformation on the platform, but Facebook doesn't want to be the arbiter of truth as a private company. So we worked with a bunch of sort of established third-party fact checkers. We use Pointers International to sort of help us find good partners in the space. We work with partners on both sides of the aisle. When information starts on Facebook, we use a variety of sort of machine learning signals that let us know if something might be false or clickbaity. And we also allow you as a user, if you see a piece of information on Facebook that you think is false or misinformation, you can actually mark it as misinformation and we'll send it to one of our third-party fact-checking partners. Those partners will then review the content and decide whether it's false or not. If they mark that content as false, we take a couple of immediate steps. First of all, we aggressively downrank that content in newsfeed, meaning it is much less likely to be seen by a user. However, if it is seen by a user, when that user looks at the content, we will not only show a label on the content that says this content has been marked false by a third-party fact checker, we also show you that fact-checking article so you can sort of read and learn more. If you try to share that content, we'll put up a little interstitial and we'll say, hey, before you share this, just so you know, it was marked false by a third-party fact checker. And if you had already previously shared that content on your Facebook account, we would then send you a notification and say, hey, you shared this article yesterday, just so you know it was marked false by a third-party fact checker. You might want to consider deleting it or doing something else with that content. So that's sort of how we let people know if content is false on the platform. So we use sort of machine learning, but we also rely really heavily on reports from the community. You guys letting us know if you see something is false, because machine learning is still really in a very early infancy stage here.
And just lastly, quick on that for now, the timeline, how long are we talking from something being posted to something potentially being flagged? What's the...
Yeah, so usually it's an hour or two. That being said, we have special circumstances in place sort of around elections, and we're able to, our machine learning is at a place where a lot of times there's sort of a specific story that is a piece of misinformation, and it is shared by like several different false news outlets, right? There are Macedonian troll farms. And so we're very good at like taking that story and marking false all of these stories that are basically the same thing, but maybe are being published by 74 different false news outlets. So it's not just looking at that single piece of content, but all pieces of content that basically fit into the bucket. So I think that's sort of the first part of it. And the second part is we're already seeing these, when we look at people who are propagating misinformation, I think the truly scary people are the foreign actors, right? The people who are doing it for ideological reasons. Like, they want to disrupt our election. But the other and the much bigger set of people are people who are doing it for financial reasons, right? They have these clickbaity troll farms, most of them actually coming out of Macedonia, and that's a lot easier to stop because we can disrupt their financial incentives really quickly. So we've actually seen that sort of section of false news really fall away in the last few months as we've made it pretty impossible for them to monetize on the platform. They're not doing it for ideological reasons. If you take away any financial incentive, then they tend to go away. That being said, there are still the state actors that we need to be worried about, and that's sort of where the third-party fact checkers come in.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks. The news, I think, from the last few days has done a couple of important things. First, the indictment on Friday. Well, my team and I have been out talking to secretaries of state and county clerks and municipal commissioners around the country for the last 2 years since the last presidential election. And 2 years ago, there was plenty of resistance to the fact that there was a problem at all. Oftentimes, it would split down party lines, but as Senator Krueger alluded to, a lot of the secretaries of state and others out there felt that they were battling the press more than any kind of an adversary. So this indictment, where we're pointing at 14 actual GRU, actual Russians who are doing something here, we've got pictures we can throw up or names we can throw up, that pretty much ends that phase of the discussion. There will be a few holdouts here and there, but for the most part, we've got a level playing field. We're all of the understanding that there is a problem, that we are under attack, the vote is under attack, this nation's under attack, and we need to do something about it. And then I guess second related to that is that we have an adversary that we can think about now. We understand what their resources are, we understand how they're coming after us, and from what we're doing, those of us who are defending the locations where the votes are, can now start to draw our battle lines against that particular adversary. All states are in a different situation. They'll defend themselves differently. All counties, all municipalities have a little bit different situation. But the big four things that you want to get done are still the same. Of one, protecting the voting machines, the infrastructure, making sure that you can't mess with the actual vote as it's being recorded. Two, defending the voter registration database. What Assemblyman Vandal was talking about before about making sure that the data is good about who's registered and who's not. He's talking about blockchain. Third is making sure that you can detect the fraud as it's happening through sampling or good auditing practices, but also having some faith in the ability to have a good recount when you need it. So it's all that faith in the count and the recount control that goes around that. And then fourth, everyone's making changes, adding new things, taking new things away. But anytime we're making a change to technology or process, that we are baking in security from the beginning. We're choosing a vendor who's been thinking about security and has good security and defense measures in place, and putting those practices in place all the way through the implementation of something new. So bringing those kind of two things to light, I think, are really good outcomes of the indictment. I can't speak so much to the press conference, but I would say that the reaction of the media in general to what's happened indicates that the preponderance of those in the business of defending the vote certainly understand that there is a problem and we need to do something about it.
Thank you. Senator Kaminsky.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think this is a really important discussion. My goal over the last 2 years, since basically the special election I had in April of 2016, followed by the general in 2016, was to, and Assemblyman Skoufis was on top of this as well because he was the victim of this, was to let everybody know that the false social media ads were pervasive in New York State, that this wasn't just a national issue, it wasn't just about Russia or the Clinton campaign, that this was happening very locally. So what do I mean? There would be a Facebook group that would pop up in someone's feed called Long Islanders for Clean Drinking Water. It would then have an ad saying, last year, Todd Kaminsky voted to deprive Long Island of $10 million of clean water drinking money. And if you liked it, all your friends would see it. It would go into their feeds. And if you commented on it, all your friends would see it. If you commented something like, this is not true, your comment would be removed in like 10 minutes. There would actually be mathematically false things there, such as there'd be a group called Long Island Moms for Better Schools, and there'd be a picture of a kid like crying, and it would say, Todd Kaminsky deprived the Baldwin School District of $2 million last year, when in fact in the budget they had actually gained $2 million. There's nothing you could have done. There was no one to run to, there was no fact checking, and it's kind of spread like poison ivy, and you could spend all of your time trying to reach out to voters saying this isn't true. And I'll give you the truth about my record on education or about the environment, but there's an old phrase in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing. And it was a really, really terrible thing. So what we really did in the last year is tried to get a law passed, which we finally did in the budget, where who is paying for the ad has to be disclosed. Now, where I am, Facebook really is just huge. On Long Island, not a lot of people are into Twitter, and I don't know who reads their mail, but Facebook spreads like wildfire. So making sure that people know who's sending them ads, I think, was a critical reform that we were able to do. It's not everything we want, but it's very important. And I found as well during the elections I had that the press was really non-existent when it came to fact checking. So someone could put something out that, some terrible lie about you, having actually done something you didn't do, or vice versa, and there was like, look, whether it's because of staffing issues or whatever else, if you spend $30,000 and put a mailer in someone's mailbox that said, Bill de Blasio is out on Long Island campaigning for Todd Kaminsky, or there are these other fake ones, thank you, Todd Kaminsky, on behalf of undocumented aliens, thank you for standing up for our rights, some fake thing. There's no one who is like, well, wait, this is not true, and then the pressure on your side is, well, you go say something fake about your opponent, and it all comes out in the wash, and then we're in some sort of like dystopian universe where you thought in high school you would be arguing about issues at a debate table, when in fact, like, two people come to debates, your opponent doesn't show up, there's fake stuff going on everywhere, Facebook falsehoods are spreading like wild, and I was like, what is going on? And I found that, and look, I ran against a guy who I thought had no platform, did nothing, and I won by 0.5%. So like, I almost wouldn't be here right now. So I think that the Hillary, Russia, Trump issues at least made us in New York take a long look at how we conduct our elections. And yes, there are much more fundamental things about the security of our electoral sites and many things like that. I just thought that social media was like the Wild West. I thought the newspapers were asleep at the wheel. And I thought voters were just left to throw up their hands and kind of have no idea who to vote for at the end of the day, and kind of either not show up or kind of do eeny, meeny, miny, mo when they went in, because they didn't know who to believe. And people would say that to me at train stations. They say you're from New York City. You say that you're from Long Island. I don't know what to do. And you would, you would try to say, well, look, blah, 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 and then the train would come and you would never really know what happened. So I just thought it was a very frustrating universe that we needed to do a lot of work to fix in the Assembly and the Senate. I think we've taken good steps, but we still have more to go.
So just say a little bit more about what the law is now.
So the law is that if you're going to run a political ad on social media or basically any other fora, you have to say who's paying for the ad. So what we've seen now is, and thank God I'm not the target of these ads anymore, although my heart goes out to those who are, and I could be at any minute, is it would say, so I've seen these, it would say Long Island, there'd be some group called Moms for Long Island, and it would say, we want you to know that John Brooks is hurting our schools and diverting money to New York City, and then it'll say paid for by the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, which is kind of what you knew all along, but it's like right there. And at least people now can better assess. I mean, look, these things have been going on forever. I mean, there's a famous Thomas Jefferson thing he did in the election with John Adams, where he put out a rumor that Adams is dead. Like, hey, you don't even need to vote for this guy. He's not even alive anymore. I mean, so we're not going to take that stuff out of politics, but at least give people the information they need so they can better assess the advertisement in front of them.
So I want to break down the next part of our discussion sort of into two topics, continuing on sort of the hard security, and then on the sort of softer end of things, which is more on the social media side of things, or election laws in New York that are not related to cybersecurity and the machines and perhaps the tabletop exercises and such. So let's stick with the sort of hard end of things a little bit more, and please, anybody jump in, but I just want to come back to you, Eric, for a moment. What is it that you are telling people to do that they're not doing at this time? What needs to happen, if it can, ahead of this fall's elections in New York or ahead? What are you telling elected officials or appointed officials that they need to do that is not happening at this time for that security?
And it's happening in some places. I'm not saying everybody's falling out on the job, obviously, but there are certain things that certainly need to happen. One is to understand what all of the ways into the house are for the adversary. We talked about Russians, but that's not all of them. There's other adversaries as well. But figure out what the ways in. You do that with a good assessment of your own situation. Take a look. I talked about those 4 different parts, but one, taking a look at the voting machines you're using and the voting technology you're using. The voting machine manufacturers all say we're perfectly safe, we're not connected to the internet, there's no problem, but every single voting machine, you can go out to DEF CON and go to the election hacking village and see all the ways into these different voting machines. So knowing what voting machines you have and what the vulnerabilities are there so that you can see it coming, right? You know that the pathways into the house. You can list out, it can be something as simple as putting tamper-proof tape over a USB port that happens to sit right underneath the tabletop where you're voting. So relatively simple measures, relatively easy detective measures that you can put into place. One, to make sure that your voting equipment is okay. Second, making sure that you've done the good analysis, penetration testing, vulnerability assessment to make sure that your voter records are in a place that you can defend as well. People often don't think about defending the voter records themselves. But we saw the big breach in Illinois last year, or I guess that was 2 years ago now, where 500,000 voting individual identity voter records were taken. That prevents people from registering the next time. When that happened, a lot of people deregistered, particularly in mountain states. It just kind of, it does what the adversary wants to happen. It throws the whole situation to disarray. It undermines confidence in the vote, keeps people from showing up, gets them to deregister. And allows an avenue for attackers to perhaps mount some kind of a denial of service attack or do something that can prevent people from voting on election day. So those are probably the 2 big things. I talked about the auditing component and about building in that security from the beginning. So making sure that when I'm rolling out a new e-poll books application or a new system that my vendor is one who can demonstrate security from beginning to end, how it's going to integrate. But it's taken those pieces out of it. There's no one simple answer, but it's a nice multifaceted, approach that can be effected in a relatively short amount of time.
Before Senator Kaminsky jumps back in, Executive Director Ryan, at the New York City Board of Elections, and maybe you can speak to other boards of elections, what do you need that you're not getting?
We're still in the process of evaluating internal staffing needs that may be required to supplement the external services that we have been provided. Keep in mind, we leveraged a contract with the city do it to have FireEye Mandiant come in and monitor. They put their monitoring systems onto our systems, our servers, so that we could have 24/7 by 365 monitoring. That seems to be working, but clearly down the road, we would expect that we would supplement that with additional internal staff. We have a proposal that we put into the city budget, and that's going to be revisited after the November elections in the December halfway point. So we expect that we'll get additional staffing as well.
And just quickly, the ongoing monitoring, that's to check to see if any breaches are happening of voter files, networks?
Correct. That is monitoring all of our external exchange of information back and forth between anyone from the outside. I mean, the one thing that you have to keep in mind, if you're going to be open to the public, much in the same way that your house has an address so that you can get your mail delivered, you have to have an IP address to receive and exchange information. So as long as you have at least one, you have one potential area of vulnerability. And that's not only monitored by our firewall, but it's also monitored by an external vendor. Now, that having been said, we haven't, since that's been in place in 2016, we haven't noticed any suspicious activity directly related to the Board of Elections. However, we did have 2 separate campaigns that we notified that there was suspicious activity on their systems. So it's a two-way street. It may be something that prevents something from happening inside the Board of Elections, but it's also anybody that communicates with us, whether it's a campaign or a private individual. If there's suspicious activity, we're going to notify them as well.
One issue in the suburbs that's very interesting, and I suspect Assemblyman Buchwald hears the same thing, is we have our voting in schools. And after Parkland, especially, there's been a real salient push for school security, whereas someone should just not be able to walk into a school anymore without a number of checks, locks, etc. That's all true except on Election Day. And parents, teachers, and school board members are petrified about having a complete unsecure system on Election Day where anyone walks in the gym and is now in your facility. We don't know who they are. We don't know if they've been cleared. And so there's a real push now to get voting out of schools, which is problematic for a lot of reasons, mostly including space, and that's where people know to go to vote. So there's a tension between one area where we're trying to secure, obviously, our most precious resource, and the other where that's where we have to vote. For the record, if we had holidays where we could vote, which I think would be a really great idea to increase turnout, we wouldn't have this issue. But in the world we live in, we have now, and that's something that's been bubbling up.
Senator Krueger, Assemblymember Buchwald, anything you want to add?
Well, when we were hearing you say that, Todd, Michael and I from New York City were going, whoa, we won't have elections if we actually stop having schools be available. But then you saved us with your follow-up comment that, yes, we really should have early voting, other models for voting, broader absentee voting, so that we do have more options anyway. And you talked about holidays for elections, because it's very important what Todd was saying, that if we don't figure out how we make sure people can be able to vote, it doesn't really matter whether somebody has a fancy cyber way to hack. We'll just have no one voting as the problem for elections, which New York's already in serious statistical trouble on that issue. So we need to make it easier for people to vote. We need to continue to make sure our system is secure. And I was a legislator. I don't think my two colleagues on the panel were in Albany yet, but I was there when we fought very hard to make sure New York didn't follow the path of many states and just go to the computerized voting machines that had no ability to do an audit trail or a paper ballot. Michael and I were talking about that before the panel started, that looking at what's been happening around the country and the fact that there are states now throwing out their entire systems and starting again, going quote unquote backward to paper audits and paper ballots, that thank goodness New York State held out, was the last state in the nation to meet HAVA's federal obligations for new machines. But we had a long fight, and I believe the fight was worth it for the integrity of elections in New York State.
And you might be going into something else, Assemblymember Buchwald, but I want to make sure, in addition to whatever you're about to say, you mentioned $5 million for cybersecurity, hearing what exactly that's going towards, but whatever else you wanted to say first. Go ahead.
Sure, that's at the state level, and obviously we have a lot of election administration that's through our counties and in New York City, the City Board of Elections. But that's part of what is helping fund not just the Board of Elections, but in partnership with other state agencies. Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services has a new cyber incident response system that is working with the State Board of Elections. And the State Board of Elections is trying to do is establish a set of best practices that feed in through our county boards of elections, and that $5 million helps in that effort. And that gets me to actually one of the other points I want to make, which is one of the ironies in this area is that one of the best antidotes to improper outside influences and misinformation and so forth is transparency. But of course, in order to have transparency, you have to have open communications to the public. And one of the things I would certainly like to see is our election administrators, work on figuring out, how do you get out information, not just because the law requires certain information to be out, but how to do it in a proactive way. And so Michael Ryan was speaking about, well, if you have something happen on Election Day, where do people go to get their official information from the Board of Elections or official agencies? And right now that's going to be websites and Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds perhaps, and giving a sense of, well, how secure are those? We had an incident on Election Day this past November where the county executive then running at the time for re-election put something up on his Facebook feed that was political in nature, and because the County Board of Elections had the Facebook feed on their county website, there was a political ad essentially on the County Board of Elections website. That's not appropriate, and so figuring out what are the sources of information. But other things, Senator Kaminsky talked about potentially changing polling places. Well, right now, what's the rule in New York State? If you change a polling place, if Board of Elections changes a polling place, they have to alert voters only a handful of days in advance of the date of election. Now, obviously, a best practice would be to do it as soon as you made the decision to change the polling place, and perhaps some boards of elections around the state do that, but the law doesn't require that. And in any case, we should be having a mentality in government of trying to be as transparent and proactive when it comes to flow of information. That's certainly what the Democracy Protection Act does. It makes transparent social media posts, just like we have for TV and radio and so forth. But we certainly can't rely on either the campaigns themselves to police what's going on, or the news media overall. There's just too much information. So what we do need are authoritative places that people can make sure they get at least basic information about, like, how the election's being run and what they need to know for that.
And Senator Krueger, you said in your first remarks, elections will be hacked in the future. You said with certainty. So what is your fear when it comes to that? What are you looking to partners in government to do? Are there certain things that are on the table right now that are being discussed that really need to be pushed forward? When you express that with certainty, what else are you thinking about?
So maybe it's my general cynicism about the world today as opposed to a fact. But how every time there's a credit card breach or a medical record breach, you get notices, you've been breached. But probably, how many are in the same story? I've already been provided free identity check software for like the rest of my life based on how many times I've already been breached, right? So I don't know how the companies are making any money off of us, because we just all have it forever now based on the number of times we've been breached. So I truly do believe that we're living in a world where we've all moved to technology. There's lots of advantages to it, but it opens us up to, I'm starting to think, anybody who's done one programming class in a community college to be able to figure out how to hack. I know when I was fighting very hard to keep the kinds of machines in New York State for voting that allowed the paper ballot and an audit option and not a centralized, it all goes through the internet to downtown and that's the numbers. I was getting presentations from people who would say, look, we assigned a bunch of first-year college students to break into the machine that Ohio was buying, and they could all do it in the first hour and a half. When everyone who takes the college computer class can do it in the first hour and a half, you should be very, very worried. And I know that there's a whole universe of smart computer people who are, some of them right here in this room today and sponsoring this event, I suspect, who then have teams of people trying to counter it. But it's just always going to, I feel, be a game of you protect us from X that happened, and then they go over here and figure out how to come in another way, and then you look and go, ooh, uh-oh, another way to breach. And it's just going to be a game of gotcha and whack-a-mole, so to speak, forever. And that we need to, I heard the word redundancy in the previous panel a number of times. We need to keep building in redundancies and ways that if we can't necessarily protect, we at least can see it so that we can try to do something about it.
And Michael, you mentioned before a form of redundancy with the two memory devices in the systems. And Eva, I want to make sure we're coming back to you in about 2 minutes. So we're going to come back to social media and some of the softer questions around security here. But I do, and this is for anybody who wants to jump in, I do wonder, we want results immediately, right? We want our election results. I mean, we want to know before polls close who's leading and what's happening, and we want to crown winners as quickly as possible. In the age we're in now, should we be moving away from that? Should we be holding off on announcing the results of precincts that are coming in, or should there be a certain sort of cooling off period to make sure that everything's been done securely before we announce results on election nights?
Well, New York City is very proud of the work that we've done. Actually, we've been a leader not only in New York State, but actually in the country in terms of the speed at which election results are processed on election night.
So that's a no.
Well, but your point is well taken. So if there is a problem, we have backup systems in place. We can leverage police department personnel to shut down the uploading of the results from the poll sites and shift that to the local police precincts. If that is an issue still, that there's an ongoing, say, a DDoS attack, we can then shift those resources from the police precincts back to our sites where we collect the materials on election night, so that the results would be then uploaded in a hardwired environment, not subject to the external interference. So that's one of the things that was put in place literally, 4 or 5 days before the presidential election in 2016, and we've kept it that way. It's redundant. It's more costly to have those backups in place, but we feel that those backups are important, and we are very hopeful that the vendors that supply the PMDs to us stay well ahead of the curve on the encryption side of things, so that it would make it much more difficult. The other piece of it, though, we think, is that if your desire is to make chaos, then it makes sense to attack us there. If your desire is to affect election results, then it makes no sense to attack us there. So it really would depend on the motivation of the group or groups that was trying to do that.
When you say attack us there, as you said earlier, the machines can't really
Correct.
be breached. It's the upload of the information.
Right. It would be then preventing us from transmitting the results quickly and efficiently on election night. And if it's a chaos moment, then chaos will prevail for a couple of hours. But if it's somebody that's really trying to get candidate A elected over candidate B, then that's a loser effort for those folks.
And Ben, let me also remind the room, election night results, if they are reported, and they're not always reported this way, election district by election district, that's actually one of the best safeguards to making sure that things have been breached. If all you're told is the top line result, who won, who lost, the total number of votes, but you can't tell on election night that the solidly Democratic district just voted overwhelmingly for President Trump, then that's part of the infrastructure protection, is you have more information actually released, more granular information that eventually is public anyway, and that to me is as much the response. And I know our friends in the news media would also appreciate having that, but obviously folks in academia.
Ben, I think that
I only ask it as a question of security. I don't want things to change, but if they need to.
Look, I think the tardiness of how things are reported, especially in Nassau, really undermines people's confidence in the system. I mean, there are literally people picking up like sticks. Police drive them to some central location, which could take 50 minutes. They get uploaded by somebody who must not really have had any coffee that day. And at 11:30, we find out who wins a race when half the people are asleep or give up or whatever. It's like the Flintstones. So, I mean, we got to do better than that. There's got to be a better way to figure out who won a lot quicker. I mean,
New York City might. Do you talk to New York City? I mean, it's very different, right?
Something's got to happen. I mean, it's like it's the Stone Age out in Nassau. It's terrible.
There have been conversations, I will say, and to my friends in Nassau that do this work, I know that the process hasn't moved as quickly as they would like either, but I know they're making efforts in that direction.
But also, you're showing your youth, Todd, and congratulations on a brand new baby. Because many of us in this room remember years and years with the big old machines in New York City where somebody who couldn't see was holding a flashlight trying to read the numbers out of the back of the machine and then yelling it to someone who couldn't hear, who would write it down, and that would be the numbers you'd work off of on election night. We were always amazed anything was close to the facts, right? Because it would be somebody who'd gotten up at 5 a.m. to be a poll worker, right, or a poll monitor, and so it was, 20 hours later they were exhausted, and really the blind yelling at the deaf. And that was how we counted the elections. So I feel we've made a lot of progress.
So
But Ben, I think-
Eva, let me come, oh, go ahead, Eric.
Just one more thing. I think Michael's right about, if we step back and think about what our adversary is really trying to get done here, it's not usually to try to change the outcome of the vote, it's to undermine confidence in the system and to sow discord. And if they can affect chaos, then they win, right? So a decision to delay the announcement of the vote for a day, 2 days, 3 days until it's right, that's the voting or online equivalent of TSA, right? The terrorists kind of won because they made us all spend an hour and a half standing in line every time we go try to fly somewhere, and maybe Putin can say, look, at the American system is worse because they don't know who won for 3 days. Here we know who won, I guess, before we vote. But so it's a trade-off.
So Eva, thank you. We're going to have a time for a couple of audience questions if you want to get those ready in about another 5 or 10 minutes. I don't know if there's someone from City and State keeping a close eye on the questions and the timing. But Eva, you shared earlier some of the ways that Facebook has changed protocols, but you're still not taking down the stuff that is determined to be fake news, to use that term in its actual meaning. Why not? Why not take down the things that are determined to be fake?
So I think that sort of the issue here is there's a lot of people with a lot of different opinions about sort of how we should handle news, and a lot of people with a lot of different opinions about what is false news, what isn't, what's misinformation, where is something just sort of traditional negative campaigning versus like really edging into false. And I think that there are pieces of content and things like voter misinformation. So I think there's an important sort of distinction here. First of all, there's like some traditional false news. Then there is voter misinformation. Voter misinformation is against Facebook's terms of service, and we take down voter misinformation, right? If somebody has a graphic up that is like, Democrats vote on Tuesday, Republicans vote on Wednesday, like that comes down, right? Just text your vote to Hillary and you don't have to go to the polls. Like that's not allowed. We take that down immediately, right? That has significant real world harm. So that's something that comes down from Facebook. But when it comes to sort of information that's being marked false by fact checkers, we know that there's oftentimes disagreement about what certain fact checkers say. So we think those fact checkers are giving us a really good signal. So we want to significantly downrank that content and once again, clearly mark it as false. But we also do want to make sure that we're not removing it in case there was a mistake made, right? In case it's not perfect, in case there are people who disagree with that. So I think we're sort of trying to find a way to keep that content on the platform if it's not voter misinformation, so that we're not totally controlling what the source of truth is.